And we're live. Nuggie, you're live. Start talking about quilting.
How come it is that as soon as you lay a quilt down somewhere, the cat thinks it's for them? Come on, buddy. Hi, everybody. Welcome to our week 11 of our Floating Stars Sew Along. That's the Cindy B's Sew Along 2023. So by now you should have all your blocks together. We have our corner pieces on. And at this point, I recommend that you be giving it a really nice steam pressing. I want it to lay nice and flat. So I have already accomplished that with mine.
Before we go any further, can we please get a hello from anyone so that we know that
Everything's working
see
fine?
us and hear us?
That's a really good point. Since we're not experts here, so long as the video's working, our mic is working. Is anybody there?
It said that we had 3 people waiting, so
Okay.
there should be someone there.
Even just a thumbs up that all is good.
Oh, Janet says hi.
Hi, Janet. So that must mean our sound is good, our video is good, so we can continue on. So I've got my borders cut, and I'm just going to put all those to the side right now. And again, remember there's 2 different sizes of borders, whether you're doing the lap quilt or whether you're doing the queen size. It has a 6.5. The lap quilt has the 4.5. I think the double's 6.5 as well. So that's for this. That's for the largest one. So we've got our corners on. We've got all our side triangles on. And I know a couple people have asked us that it looked like the corner triangle was too small. In actuality, it's not that the corner was too small. The sides are a little bit bigger. So, but we have lots of fudge room that we've built into the pattern. So, we're good. There's even if your block was a little bit, or your corner was a little bit small, it'll work just fine. So what we want to do is trim up our edges now before we go on and add our borders until, just to make everything nice and square. Can I have a pencil or something to point with? So I want to show you the mark. So you know when we sewed our border on, this point right here is what we are using to square up our quilt. It's as if there was a cornerstone here and we're going to be cutting the cornerstone in half.
Almost in half.
Almost in half. So I'm going to take and start with a corner, and I'm going to take the biggest ruler that we have. So right now I have the Tucker trimmer, and it has this really nice 1/4 inch mark.
Get in there.
Can you see a little bit better?
Can you point to which lines we're looking at?
Again, so it's this from that last 16, is that the 16-inch sashing piece? The 16-inch sashing piece? That intersection right there. When we cut, we want to make sure that we cut a 1/4 inch beyond that because our seam will line up exactly with that point.
I'll also point out, because we do have so much trim up space, you can choose if you want to go a 1/2 inch from that. If you want your stars to be even a little more floating. Oh, cat on the keyboard. I think we're okay.
I think we're okay. Okay, so I'm using the 1/4 inch, and like Tiffany had just said, if I wanted to, I could use the 1/2 inch mark and line it up on those points on both sides. So you can still see I have tons of trim up space. All it's going to do is let it float a little bit more. So because we're doing this as the sample for our pattern, and our pattern does say to trim it at the 1/4 inch from that point, that's what I'm going to do. So I've got lots of seams in here, so I really want to hold this nice and straight so it won't shift. My 1/4 inch is here, My 1/4 inch is there.
It doesn't look like your diagonal is on, Cindy. I think
Oh,
yours is
thank
a
you,
little
Tiffany.
crooked.
Also make sure that the diagonal is going nice and straight, and because we have that star here in the corner, I can make sure that my diagonal is absolutely perfect. So I am going to adjust this the best that I can, that I have a 1/4 inch there, 1/4 inch here, and my diagonal is coming through the diagonal points of my star. Alrighty, so I'm only going to cut there, and I'm also going to cut this side. And now what I want to do is I want to shift my block, and I can my quilt, and I can cut all the way around. I can also do all the corners at this time if I wanted to just do that. I wanted to show you again, I love the really big rulers. This one just happens to be my 18.5 because I didn't have my 12.5 at home. But you do want to use the biggest square that you have. Most people don't have an 18, but some of these have 16. So I want to take my 1/1, put it in the upper right corner. I'm going to again make sure that the diagonal is going through the diagonal of my block. And I'm going to take that 1/4 inch and I'm going to intersect it on that seam. So my 1/4 inch, my seam will just meet that point on either side. So I've got the 1, 2, and this diagonal here. And now I can trim this corner. Now that I have the 2 corners done, I can go back to this side and I will take my long ruler. And this is one of the steps that I like to do. I have a small cutting mat at home, or cutting area at home. I'll take this up and I'll use a kitchen counter, an island, or my dining table, and make sure that everything is aligned up perfectly. So again, we still have that very same point. There's our 1/4 inch right there, and we'll have another 1/4 inch here that we can line up. So that dotted line on my ruler is lining up from point to point. And I am going to shift one more time. Now, because I want to put borders on this, and I did want to show you, I am going to have to trim up all 4 sides. So you can always speed this ahead if you don't want to watch me do all 4 sides. But with this one, I want to make sure that I'm lining up all my edges. So my 1/4 inch marks go on my the corner of my sashing blocks. I want to make sure that the edge of my ruler is on the edge that's already previously cut on both sides. And then I can trim this off. And that's our first side. So I did this corner. I'm going to go back and do this corner. Again, I don't care which ruler, whichever ruler works best for you.
But we do want a square. We do not want to use our 6x24 ruler to cut this.
If I was trying to use this ruler and do it this way, our corner could be wonky and it might not end up being square. So we really, truly, like Tiff said, do want to use a square on that point. Okay, so I'll use both rulers since I have them both. Again, I've got a 1 and a 1 in the upper corner. My diagonals going through the diagonal of the of our star, and my 1/4 inch marks are going on that lower seam. Everything's lined up the best that I can, and we're going to cut. Use my shoulder, cut. I'm sure that I was in the camera. And now we have the top or the bottom, the end piece that we can square up. Again, there's my 2 points, my 1/4 inch points. I like using this side because it has the dotted quarter. That's why I turned it around. I'm lining up with this corner. I'm lining up with this corner. Sometimes I have to, if I knew that it was perfectly straight there, I'll just straighten everything back out again. There's my second side.
Careful, you got a cat on the quilt.
Oh, one more corner. No, no nugget. Off you go. No, you cannot lie on my cutting board. It's sad when they're not the center of attention, isn't it? Again, remember, if we're using one of the creative grids or a regular square, we do want that diagonal coming through 1, 1.
Oh dear.
I am adjusting my 1/4 inches so they're on that sashing seam. I'm adjusting so my diagonal runs through the center of my square. The best that I can. Sometimes they're off just a smidgen. And remember, because it's a loose piece of fabric, we can always move it a little bit. Sometimes it's not that your piecing is crooked, it's just that the fabric is a little bit fluid, so it's going to do what it wants to do.
Especially when you have it hanging off a table. The force of gravity on it can affect how straight it is.
Okay, so here's my long side. Now my ruler won't reach all the way, and the same with you people that are doing the doubles and stuff like that. Your ruler will not reach all the way, so we have to do in a couple cuts, but our 24-inch ruler does reach from our trim points, from that point to this point. So my 1/4 inch, I want to make sure that my ruler's over a little bit so that I can align it up so it's nice and straight. My 1/4 inch on my sashing point, and I can cut. One last cut. Now I can move it over again. Trying to get it straight as I can. I'm lined up perfectly on this side, not so much on this side. Looking at those intersections, I think I'm good to go. And there we go. So now my quilt is perfectly square, and we're ready to take and put our bindings on it.
Borders.
Thank you, Tiff. We're ready to put our borders on it. I am just going to step back. Tiff's going to set up my sewing machine because we're going to talk about sewing borders together. And I'm just going to grab a glass of, oh, I forgot one more side. Woohoo! Just a minute. The other end. That won't do. It'll be really hard to put a border on that. There we go. So that should be 4 of them now. Alrighty, I'm just going to grab a drink of water. Tiff's going to set up my sewing machine. This will just take me a second. Oh, I hope we have thread. We do. Alrighty, let's talk a bit about borders. Here's my theory. I love to sew. I'll just move this out of the way a little bit so I can have a little cutting table here. I love to sew all my borders together and then measure them onto the quilt. And we're going to talk about that in a second, but let's talk about putting the borders together first.
Why do you sew them together as one long strip?
Sometimes, depending on the size of your quilt, you can end up saving a whole strip of fabric. So it used to be you would sew 2 together for the top and the sides, and then another 2 together or 3 together for the other pieces. And then you had all of these little pieces of 2.5-inch fabric left over. This way, sometimes I have noticed that I take 1 strip less than a pattern is on a large quilt, because and it's also going to stagger my seams. But I have also 1 piece of 2.5-inch strips left, so it's a better usable piece of fabric as opposed to 4, 5 little ones. So that's why I like to do it that way. The big debate, are we going to sew it on a diagonal or are we going to sew it straight?
I am going to move the microphone, so just don't talk for a second. There we go. Now they should be able to hear you.
Thank you. Okay. So I don't know if you can get in here. Here's my theory on borders. Old school always said that we had to sew the border together on a diagonal. I usually do it on smaller borders because there's not as much waste, but on a larger border, like this sunflower, our 4.5 or outside border, or 6.5-inch borders, if I sewed it on a diagonal, I would be cutting off this much fabric. And we were talking before the video, if you have a queen size quilt and you have maybe 9 border strips, you are actually cutting off and throwing away almost a full strip of fabric. So my frugal heart doesn't like to do that. And they used to say that it was less noticeable in your quilt if it was a diagonal. I don't know about that either. So in my point of view, a small strip, I'll do a diagonal, unless it's a stripe, because then if it's a stripe and you're trying to line up diagonals, it's really hard to do, so then I'll sew that as a straight. But on a large border like this, I will sew them together straight. So just how to sew them on a diagonal, I am going to let you, give you a demo on that. Alrighty. Here's one of the times that I like to have my mat, because it's going to help keep my strips nice and straight. So I am going to have my bottom strip face up, and I'm going to have this strip exactly perpendicular to it. I can't cut sitting down. Face down. These are batik strips, so it really doesn't show that much. But when I sew regular fabric strips together, I love to sew opposing salvages together. What I mean by that is, you know, most fabrics have one salvage is very white or thick with words on it, and the other salvage is sometimes not white or it's thinner. If I train my brain, and I have, that I don't usually even think about it anymore, if I'm sewing borders or binding or even backing together, I always sew it with the white salvage to the not white salvage, and then I'm always guaranteed that my directions of my fabric are going in the same direction. So if you are doing a directional fabric like with an animal or something, I don't have to think about whether it's right side up, whether it's right side down, upside down. I always know that if I sew the white salvage to the not white salvage, they're always going to line up absolutely perfect. Alrighty, so I've got them nice and straight, and now what I want to do is I want to sew exactly from this intersection to this intersection. Old school method is I'm going to draw a line. I am going to stick a little pin in there, and I am going to sew this to say it's on the line. I want to analyze it, and when I drew, I noticed my line's a little bit this way. I want to sew just to say that I'm on the right side of that line. This is the old school method. The way I normally like to do it now is using Doug Lecko's folded corner ruler. Thank you, Tiffany. But I forgot to bring it today. So that being said, if you have the Doug Lecko ruler, and I think we did demo that on Borders last year's sew along, so you can take a look at that. I am just going to put my needle in the down position so I can butt it up right with that intersection. I am going to sew. Foot up. Now I am going to just make sure that my seam is in the right direction.
Check your seam before you move the sewing machine.
Oh, I know it's right, but I am going to check that. So I have my seam sewn. Before I cut the excess fabric off, I want to make sure that it's going to open up, that our edges are going to align, and life is going to be good. We have on occasion sewn from this corner in, and if we do that, it'll fold back on itself. Also, a really good thing to check is whether, you know, the right sides together and everything like that before we cut. So now that I know that is exactly right, I can cut that excess fabric off. So I'm just lining my 1/4 inch line up with the seam that I sewed. And I'm just going to nick off these little triangles, aka dog's ears. I am going to give this a press. Normally I would use the iron. I'm just going to finger press this one because I have the rest of them all sewn together already. So we can continue on. Again, with the large border, all I want to do is I'm going to take my pieces. Again, this is a batik and it doesn't show, but I want to make sure that I'm going to put the right sides together with that white selvage to the not white selvage. I'm going to lay them like this so they're lined up absolutely perfect. No, this. Thank you. And before I sew, remember, we never want to put a selvage in the quilt. It shrinks differently than our regular fabric. So at this point, I've left it on there so I knew which one was the white selvage and the not white selvage. I can now cut my selvage off. I can put a couple pins in there, and I can scoot over and sew that on the sewing machine. So,
move this, hold on.
It doesn't matter what kind of borders you have decided to put on your quilt, what size, you're going to be basically sewing them all together exactly the same. So all of your long strips are all getting sewn on. This one, our first border, has cornerstones. So when we're measuring our borders, we're going to do it a little bit differently. So I have my quilt. And here we go. Here's my spiel about borders. If I took my quilt to the sewing machine and I just grabbed my border and started sewing it on and hacked it off at the end or cut it off at the end, what would end up happening is every seam gives you a little bit of stretch. Even because it's, you know, there's log edges, your seams can open up a little bit. The outside seam edge is not stable. So if I take it and I look at my quilt and go, look at what I did, you have a tendency to stretch the outside edge. So we want to make sure that we put the borders on properly. I've had absolutely stunning quilts come into the shop that I couldn't get on the long arm because they did not lay flat. And that was basically because the borders were just sewn on from the top all the way to the bottom, and then they cut them off. So the first border was a little wavy, then the second border was more wavy, then the third border was more wavy. I've literally had to take some pleats about an inch of fabric just to get those borders to fit. So the traditional way to do it is this. You measure 6 inches in, you take your measurement from both sides, you take the measurement in the center, you add them together and divide by 3. Now, some people, when they start hearing all this math and all these productions, their eyes kind of glaze over and they go, I'm not going to do that. So this is, if you're not going to do that, at least follow my no math method. So what I'm going to do with my no math method is I'm going to first cut my long borders. And what I am going to do is I am going to go through the center of my quilt. I don't know exactly how long my quilt is. I could have got a tape measure and I could measure them and I could cut it to size. But what I am going to do is I'm going to use the center of my quilt. If it's not in a quilt on point, you have a seam that goes right along the middle, and I will use that to align my borders. Because I do not have a seam because this is put on point, but I do have these marks that line all the way up. So I'm going to take my border fabric, I'm going to overhang it because I do have some selvage on that end that I need to cut off, and I am going to align it up.
And you're going to pin it?
Okay, so most people don't have the opportunity to have such a big table, especially if it's a queen size quilt. So what I want to do is I'm just going to put a couple pins in here just to hold it in place.
Okay. Or this is one of those things that you can do on the floor.
You could do it on the floor, yeah. Hard on the knees. You young people can do it on the floor. Us older people, maybe, we'd like a table. So I have over here this little piece of overhang. Before I move it, I am just going to align my ruler up with the edge of my quilt. I'm going to scoot around and I am going to cut that so it's nice and flush. So I have a couple pins, so I know my border is not going to move. I'm going to adjust this, find my mat, and I'm going to go off the side. Here's a good point. If for some reason my seam ended up really close to the edge, it's not visually pleasing, so I would move my strip a little bit. But this one it's in the middle, so I'm good to go. So now that it is lined up perfectly, I can take this ruler, I can cut it flush to the side of my quilt. Now I don't know exactly what that measurement is, but at least I know I've measured it through the stable part of my quilt. If you have a quilt that has a lot of bias and stuff like that, you're worried about it, I do like to measure a couple places through it and make sure that they're very close to the same. If they're off 1/8 of an inch or maybe 1/4 of an inch, it's not too bad. But if you measure one side and say it's 60.5 and you measure the other side and it's 62.5, something's wrong in your piecing. That either you have a different measurement, the block that you had to put in or something. So at that point, check it and make sure that find out why it's off that much. Yeah. So I've got this first border cut. I am going to, right away, because there's a right and a left side, I am going to cut my second one. I will lay it right next to the one that I did. It's upside down, but it really doesn't matter. Not at this point. Put another pin. Now I can move it. I cut my ruler and I'm going to cut. So now I have two borders that are identical in length, measured through the stable part of my quilt, and life is good. Here's where putting on borders can differ for you.
Well,
this pattern calls for a cornerstone. And what is a cornerstone? Where is my little blue? It was on the other.
Mm-hmm. I don't know where your cornerstones went.
My cornerstones have disappeared.
Oh.
They were on the table.
Mm-hmm. Maybe Nugget stole them.
Yeah, she's standing.
Oh, they're underneath of the table.
They're under the table. Ah, there they are. Okay. So the cornerstone is literally exactly what it says. It is a corner that will be sewn in to fill, it is a square that is going to be sewn in to fill in the corner. That being said, because it is taking up the corner space, I can cut my top and bottom border right now. If you had opted not to put in the cornerstones, we have to sew the side borders on first, press them open, and then we'll measure the top and the bottom. Because we want to make sure.
I'm sorry, you just said press them open, but press towards the border.
I'm sorry, yes, open up the border, press it towards the border strip.
I just wanted to be clear.
Exactly. So if we're not, remember, this is if we're not using cornerstones, our top and bottom border have to come all the way out to the edge of our first border on the sides. So once it's sewn and pressed, we will then cut our borders and we will measure. Clear as mud? Clear as mud. Okay, so there's my two long borders. And if I look at my quilt, because I am doing the cornerstones, I can do this. I can now cut my, I'm gonna lose my cornerstones. I am going to cut my small borders. And again, I am finding somewhere close to the center that has some lines that I can follow.
Oh, Nugget, stop it.
And I am going through the corner of my sashing square and also the intersection of my star blocks out to the edge. Oh, I flipped my strip around. This strip has salvage on it. I'm using the other end of my long strip, so I'm just going to move that over so I can cut it.
Shouldn't you use the other side first though? Otherwise your seams will be in weird places.
I'm looking at this. Because we're using cornerstones, we're not even going to have to use any of the seam.
Oh. So we could have left.
So we could have left the two strips off.
Okay, so if you haven't sewed your strips together yet.
And if you are using cornerstones, that means that the strip, one full strip of fabric, should fit from side to side. I'm just going to put this pin in there because I have to move my mat. And I am going to, I'm going to see where my seam is here. I've got a seam very close to the end. So because I have the extra fabric this time, I don't want to put the seam there. So I am just going to move it.
Can you get it on there without the seam?
I can. I am just going to unsew this just a little bit. So I'm going to take that piece off so I can line up that corner. I can cut. I have to walk around the table.
This is what we get for doing the math a month ago and sewing it today.
But that's okay. That's okay. So I got that there. I am going to align this up perfectly. Put my pin because I have to move it. As soon as I have to move the quilt, I want to make sure that I have pinned it so it's nice and stable. Got lots of space. Alrighty. What time is it? It's 1:30. Shall we have to pin the borders and stuff. So the top and the bottom border, I am going to do this. I am going to take my cornerstones and I am going to sew one cornerstone to either end of our sashing strips.
Border strips.
Thank you. To our border strips. I need a cheat sheet on all these. Okay, so that would be my first step to get these ready to go on the top and the bottom. I'm going to sew, and you have to sew with that perfect 1/4 inch seam.
And what are you going to press towards?
We are going to press towards the binding strip, the border strip. If I strip, because this one is going out, remember when I sew this border on here, I'm going to press towards my border strip. When I'm doing it on my sashing, I want to press towards my border strip, and then my seams are going to butt together.
Great. Good.
Alrighty? So I'm just going to put these to the side right now. I want to sew these on. I will if we have time, but I want to show you how to measure the borders. Pin. And measure.
Oh, they're right here.
Thank you. Those are the long ones?
Yes.
Awesome. So what I want to do is 1/4 my borders and 1/4 my quilt. What? All that means is to find the center point. I'm going to fold it together. And I'm going to give this a little press, or I am going to mark it with a pin. Pins are.
Yeah, these are.
Oh, the nice big ones.
They
show up better.
Oh, I like them for marking because they're just heavy.
Okay.
Sorry.
Alrighty. So I've got my pin exactly in the center fold. I'm going to fold my strip one more time. Align my pin to the edge. And find the quarters. So if I stick this in the fold like that, I can now open it up and I can put a pin on either 1/4 mark. So now I have my border strip
with 3 pins.
I'm going to do the identical thing to my quilt. So first I'm going to fold it in half. Find my center. And I'm going to fold it again and find the quarters. If you are putting borders on a quilt that are not on point, a lot of times you will end up that your center isn't identical, it's a seam. So your pin will go exactly where the seam is. So when you fold it in half, don't align the edge of the seam allowance on the edge of your quilt. You want to actually line up that stitched seam on the edge of your quilt, and that will mark it into the proper width.
Sometimes the seam allowance will just stick out.
Well, if it's folded that there was an actual seam right in the middle, we want to measure the seam to the edge
from the front of the quilt, not the seam allowance.
Exactly. Yeah. And I could do this on both sides right away if I wanted to. But now I have 3 pins on my border, 3 pins on my quilt, and the 2 edges. And now all we're going to do is match the pieces. I want to make sure that I have my border strip right side down. I am just going to cut off this little dog ear that I forgot to cut off. So I'm going to take my center pin and I'm going to align it and place a pin in the center. I am going to take my 1/4 Align those two. And I'm also going to align my edge. Remember, we already cut these to the right length. So I want to make sure that I align them right to the edge of our quilt. This is a long stance, and if it's a queen size quilt, it's going to be even longer. So put in as many pins as you think you need. With this one, I'll do 1 or 2. I'm doing 2 on this one because there's a little seam there. I want to hold my seam. Hi, Nug. Aligning my 2 pins. I'm going to sew this or pin this edge first. Aligning the end with the end of my border strip. Aligning this up. And aligning this up. And there you have it. So if there happens to be any fullness in my quilt, it's going to be taken up in between those pins. Shall we sew it on? Let's sew it on. Again, just like any time, I'm going to turn my sewing machine on. I am going to set this for 2.0 stitch length. And I'm going to sew with that best 1/4 inch seam that I can. If you do have some fullness in between your pins, there's a couple ways that you can wrestle it into the right position. I'm going to sew with my needle in the down position. If my sewing machine has that function, I will make sure that I press it so it's always going to stop. Or I'm going to hand crank it so the needle's going to hold my quilt. There's a lot of weight here that's going to pull on it, and if I'm trying to adjust things, it's going to pull it out of sync. So we want to make sure that it stays. I want to make sure that, again, my border is matching the edge of my quilt perfectly. If I do have a little bit of fullness there, if I wrap it around my hand like this, it will help take up some of that fullness. Usually the fullness will be on your quilt, so that's why I always sew with the quilt down, because the feed dogs will also help taking up some of that fullness. I want to make sure if it starts to push out the front, I want to make sure that all that fabric stays where it's supposed to be. Use your purple thing. Keep all that fullness in between the pins. That's why we pin them there. I don't want to take my pin out and just move the fullness down, because then all of a sudden our border is going to be too small. It's all going to slide down to the bottom.
Or too big, one way or the other. If anyone has any questions, now would be a great time to ask. We are sort of coming to the end of our demo here, so now would be a great time to ask questions. Sorry to cut you off.
No, not at all. So I'm going to sew this one all the way. Again, making sure everything stays really nice and flat. All lined up perfectly. Some people have a real hard time keeping the fabric in between their pins nice and flush with the edge. That pins in a bottle are perfect piecing seam-align glue works wonderfully in there, because you can have like 18 different pins in there. So it has helped a lot of the beginners keep their borders on nice and straight. Nugget. So we'll quickly sew this along. I'm coming to a seam seam and I don't know if it's flipped in the right direction, so I'm going to make sure that that's in the right direction.
Oh, so we just had a question about the cornerstones. So did you want to sew those onto your strip next?
I'm going to, yes.
Does that all answer the question?
Can I have the other long strip? Or just a little piece of a strip? Just some of the yeah, thank you. Just for lack of time, I'm just going to cheat and I am just going to sew this onto the corner just so we have a visual of how the border goes on. I will unsew this later, as opposed for you to sit there watching me sew a full border on the other side of the quilt. Okay, so now that my borders are on, I'm going to press them towards the border strip. And I would do this with an iron, again, just for time's sake. I'm just going to finger press this. I also want to take and quickly sew a cornerstone on either end of my top strip. Again, making sure that I am right sides together. A little bit harder to when it's a batik. That being said, if it had it in the other direction, nobody'd be able to tell at the end of the day. And I am going to sew this to the other side. So remember, this time I want to press towards my sashing piece, and you will see why in a minute.
Border, not sashing.
Border.
Away from the cornerstone.
Away from the cornerstone. That's about the third time I've called it sashing. Okay, so press it towards our border, away from the cornerstone. So now when we find our centers on our strip, we are going to go straight from edge to edge. Find our center. Some people will just press this with the iron so they got a nice sharp crease and they can use that. So long as it shows visually on your fabric, you're quite welcome to do that. On camera, I think we need the pins. So now I've found my quarters.
Honestly, I always use the pins because I find if there's, you know how that center fold of the fabric sometimes doesn't fully come out and there'll still be a fold line from your original fabric. I will sometimes get that mixed up and then I end up unpicking an entire border. So I prefer to always mark with pins.
Okay, so again, I'm lining up my quilt from the edge of my border, my side borders, to my center border. And I am going to, again, fold it in quarters. Line that up with the edge. Find my quarters. So if you think about it, it's no longer the actual quarter marks
of the quilt.
It is from the edge. If you did fold and mark them previous to putting the borders on, do the same thing with your strip. Your pieces will line up. But if you haven't, this is the way I like to do it. So now I'm going to take my strip, I want to make sure that I put them right sides together so my seams are on the outside. I am going to take the center and just pin it on the same way that I did previous. Aligning up my pins. Lining up my pin. Now, because I have my border here pressed out, this one I pressed in, these seams are going to butt very nicely. I am going to align the edge. And I will put a couple more pins in here as I think that I need. If life is good and you lay it on top, they're automatically going to line up so nicely. I like to give myself, as opposed to trying to stretch it, I like to give myself a little leeway here. I've got a really big bow here. I think my pin here is not marked in the right spot. I know my center was fine. I might have a little bit of fullness on my corner. I think I'm going to unpick that and I unpin it, and I'm going to just measure it again. Because I had a lot of fullness only in that corner spot. There's my center. Line up those seams. There we go. My fullness is gone. Whoop! My pin came undone.
It's okay. You don't have to sew this today.
Well, I'm not going to sew this one on because I do not have a full border here, so I would have to unsew it anyways. But now that it is there, I would again sew and I can press it out. So now that I have my first border on, I'm going to continue doing the exact process for as however many borders is on my quilt.
Except our second border does not have a cornerstone.
That's right. So from this point, I would measure. I cannot cut my second border yet because I don't have my top and my bottom border on. But I'm going to put my top and my bottom border on. I'm going to press them the seam allowance towards the borders, so press them not open, not the seam open, but just press them open. I am going to measure again through the center, cutting my two side borders. I'm going to then sew them on before I cut my top and my bottom. So once I have them pressed and opened up, I can again flip my quilt, measure from top to bottom, put my top, or from side to side, and put my top and bottom.
Yeah, side to side, including
these outer borders,
and including your second border.
Exactly. Clear as mud. Clear as mud. Is there any questions? Did I answer any of the questions that were?
You
there?
did answer the cornerstone.
Okay,
question,
perfect.
So, is there any other questions from anyone? We also do want to ask you guys. Whether you want a binding tutorial next week.
Yes. I do not expect you to have your quilt finished and quilted and everything else by next week, but I can have a little sample here if you like, and we can talk about how to bind your project. So in the comments, please, or on our Facebook page, maybe we'll put a post up on our Facebook page the Cindy B So Long 2023, and we'll put a little post up there, a survey to see whether you want a binding demo next week. So if you don't, then this may be our last class for 2023. If not, we will see you next week. I've had an absolute blast. It's exciting to finally see Tiffany's pattern become actual real fabric and not just a computer program. Again. Ooh, sorry. Did I do that?
Wrecking the place.
I reckon the place. I just want to get this other border on here just so you can see. I have this beautiful sunflower fabric that is going to be my final border on the edge of my quilt. So it's really going to pull this wonderful dark blue out.
I love that.
I'll get the borders on, and I will post a picture on our Facebook page of the actual finished quilt. So I hope you've had enough, as much fun as we have, struggling through a little bit of our technical difficulties and snow and everything else, and our little four-footed helpers sometimes that pop into the picture. But we have had an absolute blast. So I might see you next week. Probably will, because binding is always a topic that some people struggle with. So we will probably see you again next Monday at 1 o'clock. As for that, don't forget to like and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Check out some of the other things there. One thing that's actually on my YouTube channel, if you were using a border print or a nice stripe, I love to do a mitered corner. It's another whole class in itself, but I do have a quite involved video up on my YouTube channel to how to do the miter that's a little bit different than everybody else's. It seems to almost always work, whereas the other methods sometimes we have to tweak a little bit. So again, we'll see you at the Facebook group, Cindy B So Long 2023. Don't forget to post your pictures. I can't wait to see all these beautiful quilts. Happy quilting, everybody.